Sleeping Stories.
In the year before the world remembered how to scream, there was silence. Not the kind of silence that comforts tired travelers or lulls children into sleep, but the silence of held breath, the silence of prey that knows the predator's circles close. Skyrim had forgotten what it meant to look up at the sky and feel terror, and that forgetting would cost more than anyone could imagine. The old Nords whispered about it in taverns when the mead flowed thick and tongues grew loose. They spoke of burial mounds that seemed to breathe at night. They told tales of stone walls covered in symbols that glowed when the moon hit its face. The young laughed at these stories. The young always laugh before they learn that some warnings are written in blood for good reason. Deep beneath the throat of the world, in caverns where light had never touched and would never reach, something stirred, not with movement, but with intention. It was the kind of waking that happens in the mind first, when dreams give way to hunger, and hunger gives way to purpose. The rocks themselves seemed to remember what was coming, and if rocks could weep, these would have wept. There was a dragon priest named Vokun, who died 3,000 years before this story truly begins. In his final moments, as his flesh turned to dust, and his mask sealed tight around nothing but bone, he carved one sentence into the wall of his tomb. The sentence read simply that the end had only paused, never ceased. No one alive could read those words anymore. The language had died with the priests who spoke it, but the stone remembered. The blades no longer guarded what they were sworn to guard. They had become bodyguards for emperors, trading their purpose for prestige. Their grandmasters had forgotten why their order was founded, forgotten the blood oath sworn in fire and ash. In the vaults beneath Cloud Ruler Temple, there sat a wall covered in carvings that told a story older than the empire itself. Dust covered those carvings. Dust covers all truths that become inconvenient. The farmer near Riverwood found dragon bones in his field. He sold them to an alchemist who ground them into powder for potions that promised strength. The farmer used the coin to buy his daughter a new dress. She wore that dress to a wedding 3 months later. She was still wearing it when the sky caught fire and everything she knew turned to ash. The dragon whose bones had been stolen took back what was owed with interest. There were signs that everyone ignored, because ignoring is easier than believing. The graybeards on their frozen mountain spoke the name of someone who did not exist yet, and the whole of Skyrim felt the mountain shake. They called it an earthquake. They blamed it on volcanic activity or shifting plates deep below the surface. They blamed everything except the truth, because the truth required them to remember things their ancestors had fought to make them forget. In the College of Winterhold, a scholar named Enther found a book in a chest that had not been opened in centuries. The book was written in dragon tongue, and Enther could only translate pieces of it. One passage spoke of a hunger that exists before time begins and after time ends. Another passage described the taste of souls. Enther closed the book. He placed it back in the chest. He told no one what he had read, because some knowledge weighs more than stone and buries you just as deep. The night before Alduin returned, the stars moved in patterns that had not been seen since the Merethic era. Astronomers at the Arcane University logged the movements and tried to find explanations in their charts. They wrote equations that made no sense. They checked their instruments 3 times and found nothing wrong with the tools. What they found wrong was the sky itself, but they could not write that in their reports without sounding mad. A child in Whiterun had a dream. She dreamed of a shadow so large it swallowed the sun, and in the shadow there were teeth the size of houses. She woke screaming and told her mother about the dream. Her mother held her close and promised that dreams could not hurt her. Mothers have been making that promise since the first mother held the first child, and it has never been true. Dreams are warnings dressed in symbols, and this dream was a warning no one would heed until it was far too late. The word spread through the criminal underground faster than through legitimate channels. Thieves and assassins trade in information the way merchants trade in silk and steel. They heard whispers of something moving in the far north. They heard that the Stormcloaks were pulling their soldiers back from certain positions for no strategic reason. They heard that even the bandits who feared nothing had abandoned camps near certain ancient ruins. The smart ones listened. The smart ones left Skyrim entirely. In the dark of night, in the deepest part of the Ratway beneath Riften, a beggar, who had lived there for 40 years, suddenly stood and walked into the tunnels. He did not come back. His friends searched for him for 3 days. They found his body at the entrance to a passage that had been sealed with rubble for generations. The rubble had been moved aside from within. The beggar's face was frozen in an expression that made hardened criminals look away. Whatever he saw before he died had shown him something worse than death. The prophecy had always existed. It was carved into the stones of Skyhaven Temple before the temple was even built. It was written in the Elder Scrolls before mortals learned to read. It existed in the space between heartbeats and in the moment before breath catches in the throat. The prophecy spoke of a last child of dragon blood who would stand when the World-Eater rose. But prophecies are tricky things. They tell you what will happen but never tell you the cost. And so Skyrim slept. The Empire crumbled at its edges while civil war brewed in its heart. The Thalmor pulled strings like a puppeteer who thinks the puppets do not notice. The people worried about taxes and crops and whether their children would find good marriages. They worried about everything except the one thing worth worrying about. They had forgotten that being forgotten by monsters does not mean the monsters have forgotten you. The last person who truly understood what was coming died alone in a cell in Helgen. He was a prisoner, accused of horse theft. He tried to tell the guards what he had seen in the mountains. He tried to explain the shape that blotted out the moon. They thought he was mad from cold and fear. They locked him in a cell to await execution. He would not have to wait long. None of them would. History has a way of repeating itself until someone learns the lesson. The Nords had learned once before that the sky belongs to no one, and that those who rule from above can only be challenged by those brave enough to look up. But that lesson had been 3,000 years ago. 3,000 years is long enough for knowledge to become legend, legend to become myth, and myth to become nothing but a story drunk men tell in taverns where no one listens. Somewhere in the space between time and the memory of time, something opened its eyes. Those eyes had been closed since before the Empire rose, since before the Dwemer vanished, since before the elves learned to hate the men who would eventually conquer them. Those eyes looked upon a world that had grown soft and forgetful and thought it looked delicious. The snow fell heavy that winter, heavier than anyone could remember. It buried roads and trapped families in their homes. The priests of the 9 Divines said it was a blessing, that the snow would protect the crops. Come spring, they were wrong. The snow was not falling. The snow was hiding. When something terrible is about to happen, even nature knows to cover its eyes. Before there was Skyrim, before there were mountains to pierce the clouds or oceans to swallow the horizon, there was chaos. Not the chaos of war or the chaos of storms, but the chaos of pure possibility. Everything existed and nothing existed. All moments happened at once, and no moments happened at all. It was a state that mortal minds cannot comprehend because mortal minds require sequence. They require cause and then effect. They require yesterday to come before tomorrow. From this chaos emerged something that would give shape to shapelessness. The entity had many names across many cultures, but the Nords would come to call it Akatosh, the dragon god of time, the first of the divines, the being who looked upon endless chaos and decided that order would be carved from it, whether the chaos consented or not. Akatosh was not gentle in this work. Creation never is. Time itself was the first weapon ever forged. Before time, nothing could begin or end. Before time, there was no birth and no death, no growth and no decay. Akatosh wrapped existence in the chains of linear progression, and everything screamed as it learned what it meant to move forward, without the ability to move back. The screaming created sound. Sound created vibration. Vibration became the first word ever spoken, and that word was the Thu'um. But time is a river that must flow downhill, and every river needs gravity to pull it. Akatosh looked upon the structure being built, and realized that beginnings require endings. Circles must complete themselves. The wheel must turn full rotation before it can turn again. And so from the very essence of Akatosh himself, from the deepest part of what it meant to be the dragon of time, came the firstborn. The firstborn had no mother, had no shell to crack through or womb to leave behind. The firstborn simply was, in the same way that time simply is. He emerged not as an infant but as something fully formed and ancient before his first breath. His scales were black like the space between stars. His eyes held the reflection of worlds that had not yet been born, and worlds that had already died. When he opened his mouth for the first time, galaxies trembled. This was Alduin. Not Alduin the conqueror, not Alduin the tyrant, but Alduin as he was meant to be. Alduin the World-Eater, the Twilight God, the being whose purpose was written into the fabric of reality itself. He was the end of the Kalpa cycle, the reset button carved into existence. When the world grew sick with age and corruption, when reality itself began to rot and fold in upon itself, Alduin would come. He would devour everything, and from that destruction, Akatosh would begin again. To call this evil would be to call winter evil for freezing the crops, to call gravity evil for pulling the fallen to the ground. Alduin was a force of nature, elevated to divine purpose. He was the forest fire that clears dead wood so new trees can grow. He was the flood that washes away the old village, so a better one can rise from the fertile soil left behind. He was mercy dressed in teeth and flame, though no mortal would ever see it that way. The other dragons came after, each one a fragment of time given wings and voice, each one a child of Akatosh, but none of them firstborn. They emerged into a world that was still being shaped. Mountains rose at their roar. Rivers carved paths at their command. The sky learned to hold clouds because dragons needed something to fly through. The ground learned to fear because dragons needed something to land upon. These were not the diminished dragons that would later haunt the burial mounds of Skyrim. These were dragons in their prime. Dragons before the concept of defeat existed. Dragons who looked upon the forming world and understood that they were its rightful masters. They spoke, and reality listened. They dreamed, and matter obeyed. They were living bridges between thought and manifestation. Paarthurnax was among them, the second most powerful dragon ever to draw breath. He flew at Alduin's right wing and learned from the World-Eater how to shape existence with nothing but voice and will. In those early ages, Paarthurnax loved his brother. He saw in Alduin the perfect expression of their father's design. He saw purpose and clarity and the cold beauty of inevitability made flesh. But then came the mortals. First, The elves, crawling out of the primordial jungles with their pointed ears and their arrogant certainty that they were favored by the gods. Then the men, shorter-lived and shorter-sighted, but breeding faster than rabbits and spreading like wildfire across every land mass they could reach. The dragons watched these creatures multiply and felt something they had never felt before. Contempt mixed with curiosity. The mortals were so fragile, they died from things that would not even scratch a dragon's scales. They died from cold, from heat, from drinking bad water, or eating spoiled meat. They died from sadness when their mates left them. They died from falling off things that were barely tall enough to be called heights. They died, and died, and died, and yet they kept making more of themselves. Alduin looked upon these creatures and made a decision that would echo through every age to come. He decided that these mortals, these tiny flickering things that lived and died between one beat of a dragon's wings, needed order imposed upon them. They needed structure. They needed to be taught their place in the hierarchy of existence. They needed to learn that some beings are born to rule and others are born to serve. The dragons descended from their mountain peaks and claimed dominion over the mortal races. They did not ask permission. Gods do not ask permission from ants. They simply landed in the centers of human and elven settlements and spoke the words that meant bow or burn. Most chose to bow. The ones who chose to burn served as lessons to those who survived them. Thus began the age of the dragon cult. An age that would last longer than empires. An age where to be born mortal meant to be born slave. The Nords of that time called it the Merithic era. They called it the time before counting. Before history was written down. Before anyone dared to imagine that the order of things could ever be different than it was. Alduin established himself at the peak of what would later be called the throat of the world. The highest mountain in all of Tamriel. From there he could see everything. From there his voice could reach every corner of the land. He built no palace because he needed none. The mountain itself was his throne. The sky itself was his hall. Any dragon could visit him there. But no mortal could reach those heights without permission. The thin air alone would kill them. The dragon priests were chosen from among the humans who showed the most devotion. They were given masks carved from the skulls of ancient dragons who had died in the chaotic early ages. These masks granted them power beyond mortal limits. They aged but did not die. They could speak fragments of the Thu'um, though their mortal throats should have torn themselves apart attempting it. They became intermediaries between the scaled gods above and the cowering masses below. Morake took dominion over the northern reaches. He wore a mask that let him see through lies and illusions. His temple was built into the side of a glacier, and prisoners who displeased him were sealed in ice, where they would remain conscious but frozen for centuries. He called this mercy, because at least they still lived. His definition of mercy was not one that brought comfort. Croesus claimed the peaks where the clouds hung lowest. He demanded that his followers bring him treasures from across the land, gold and gems and artifacts of power. He melted these offerings down and had them forged into chains. These chains were used to bind the most rebellious humans. He said that if they loved their treasures more than freedom, they should wear their treasures forever. The screaming from his temple could be heard for miles. Volsung ruled the coastal regions where the sea met the shore. He forced his subjects to build ships that would sail out into storms. These ships were manned by the elderly and the sick, those who could no longer work the fields or fight the battles. Volsung called it the final service. He said that the sea needed sacrifices to stay calm. The sea was never calm. The ships never returned. The building never stopped. Radzgat controlled the southern territories, where the forests grew thick. He decreed that no tree could be cut without a human life given in exchange. The logic was simple. A tree takes decades to grow. A human takes decades to grow. Therefore they are equal. Therefore the trade is fair. The forests of his domain became graveyards where saplings grew from the chests of the buried. Nakrin held power over the eastern valleys. He became obsessed with the concept of perfection. He studied dragon anatomy and became convinced that humans were flawed creations. He began performing experiments to improve them, removing parts he deemed unnecessary, adding parts from animals he deemed superior. The things that crawled out of his temple were no longer recognizably human, but Nakrin insisted they were improvements. Konarik was different from the others. He did not rule a territory. He ruled the other priests themselves. His mask was a combination of all their powers. He was the high priest, the voice of Alduin among mortals. Where he walked, the other priests bowed. Where he spoke, even dragons listened with something approaching respect. His cruelty was not passionate like the others. It was methodical, mathematical. He calculated exactly how much suffering could be extracted from a population before that population stopped functioning. He kept his territories balanced on that edge. The temples built to honor the dragons were architectural impossibilities. They spiraled upward in ways that seemed to defy the basic principles of weight and balance. They had no foundations because the dragon priests had learned to carve the thome into stone itself. The buildings floated on trapped sound, on crystallized words of power that hummed at frequencies just below human hearing. Walking into these temples felt like walking into the moment before thunder strikes. Inside the temples, the walls were covered in carved prayers. Not prayers of love or hope, but prayers of submission. Every surface declared the supremacy of dragonkind. Every hallway was designed to make mortals feel small. The ceilings reached heights that made necks ache from looking up. The doorways were sized for creatures much larger than humans. Everything about the architecture screamed that this space was not meant for mortal comfort. Children born during the dragon cult era never knew anything different. They were taught from infancy that dragons were divine, that service to dragons was the highest purpose a mortal could achieve, that to question the order of things was to question reality itself. These children grew into adults who taught their own children the same lessons, generation after generation, born into chains and convinced the chains were jewelry. But chains are still chains, even when you call them something prettier. And no matter how thoroughly you convince someone that slavery is natural, somewhere deep in the animal part of the brain, the part that existed before language and will exist after language dies, there remains a small voice that says no. That small voice can be suppressed. It can be ignored. It can be drowned out by years of conditioning, but it cannot be completely erased. There was a young Nord named Helgen who worked the mines beneath the temple of Konarik. He spent 14 hours each day breaking rocks to extract the metals that would be melted down to create statues of dragons. His hands bled constantly. His back had bent into a permanent curve. He had never seen the sky. He had been born in those mines and would die in those mines, and his children would die in those mines after him. One day Helgen found something in the rock. It was not gold or silver or any metal he recognized. It was a bone, a massive bone that must have belonged to something enormous. He brought it to the overseer, and the overseer brought it to the priests. The priests examined it and grew very quiet. They determined it was the bone of a dragon, an ancient dragon who had died before the order was established. They decreed the bone was sacred and must be properly enshrined. But Helgen had held that bone in his hands. He had felt how light it was, how hollow, how fragile, despite its size. He realized in that moment something that would eventually cost him everything. Dragons could die, had died, would die again. They were not immortal. They were not invincible. They were simply powerful. And power can be challenged. Jurgen said nothing about this realization. He returned to his mine and continued breaking rocks. But the thought lived in his mind, like a seed planted in fertile soil. It grew slowly, quietly. It sent roots deep into his understanding of the world. And though Jurgen himself would never live to see the revolution, his children would. His children's children would. The seed he planted would become a forest of rebellion. Others had similar moments of clarity. A farmer who noticed that dragons avoided certain plants. A blacksmith who realized that dragon scales, when shed naturally, were no harder than good steel. A mother who watched a dragon priest bleed from a kitchen accident and understood that beneath the mask was just flesh, just meat, just a mortal who had made a bargain that granted power but not invulnerability. These realizations spread like disease through a population that had no immunity to hope. They were whispered in fields where the overseers could not hear. They were shared in the darkness of sleeping halls where even the torchlight could not reach. They were passed from parent to child with a kind of desperate urgency. Remember this. Hide this. Nurture this. The time will come. And time, being the creation of Akatosh, and therefore the domain of dragons, moved forward regardless of who wanted it to stop. Time cared nothing for the wishes of tyrants or the dreams of slaves. It simply flowed, and as it flowed, it carried with it the accumulated weight of every injustice, every cruelty, every small moment of understanding that the order of things was not carved in stone, but held in place by violence and fear. Alduin sensed none of this. From his peak above the world, mortal concerns were less than the buzzing of insects. He saw the temples rising. He saw the offerings brought. He heard the prayers spoken in draconic tongue by humans whose mouths bled from shaping the words. He saw order. He saw function. He saw a system that worked according to his design. What he did not see was Paarthurnax beginning to doubt. Paarthurnax who flew lower than the other dragons, who sometimes watched the mortals working their fields and building their homes, who heard them singing songs in their own languages when they thought no dragons were near, songs about things that had nothing to do with dragons, songs about love and loss and the changing of seasons, songs that suggested an inner life that had nothing to do with service or worship. Paarthurnax said nothing about these observations, not yet. But in the private spaces of his own mind, in the thoughts he shared with no one, he began to wonder if perhaps Alduin had made an error, not a moral error. Morality was a mortal concept, but a practical one. You could force submission, but could you force it forever? And if not forever, then what came after? The answer to that question is already being written. Not in books or on scrolls, but in the hearts of those who had nothing left to lose, in the minds of those who had seen too much, in the souls of those who remembered their grandparents spoke of a time before dragons ruled, a time when humans belonged to themselves. The revolution would not begin with a battle. It would begin with a single word spoken in defiance, with one person deciding that no was a complete sentence, with the understanding that the worst thing the dragons could do was kill them, and they were killing them slowly anyway. Fear is powerful, but fear has limits, and once those limits are reached, fear becomes something else entirely. It becomes courage born from having nothing left to lose. The dragons continued to rule. The priests continued to enforce. The mortals continued to bow. But beneath the surface of that order, something was shifting. Something was growing. Something was waiting for the right moment to emerge. History has a way of building pressure slowly until the pressure becomes too great. And then everything that seemed permanent shatters all at once. Alduin remained on his mountain, convinced of his own supremacy, unaware that the longest reigns end not because the ruler grows weak, but because the ruled grow strong. He had forgotten the one truth, that even gods must eventually learn: power that demands submission will inevitably face defiance. And when defiance comes, the question is never whether the old order will fall. The question is only how much it will cost to bring it down. The cost would be measured in centuries, in entire generations born and dead before victory came, in blood spilled by the ocean full, in sacrifices that no one would remember, and heroes whose names would be forgotten. The cost would be everything, but those who paid it would pay willingly, because slavery is not life. And death in pursuit of freedom is not death at all. It is the only honest way to live. The first act of rebellion was so small that it should not have mattered. A single farmer refused to deliver his grain to the temple. He stood in his field with a scythe in his hand and said one word to the dragon priest who came to collect. No, that word hung in the air like smoke. The priest struck him down where he stood. But the farmer's children saw, and his neighbors saw, and they saw that he died standing rather than living on his knees. Within a month, 3 more farmers refused. Within a year, an entire village closed its gates when the collectors came. The dragon priests burned that village to ash and scattered the ashes into the river. But ashes float. They travel downstream. They reach other villages, and those villages see the ashes and understand the message. The message was not about obedience. The message was that resistance had begun. The dragons noticed, but did not worry. Mortals had always been difficult. Some generations were more troublesome than others. The solution was always the same: overwhelming force applied without mercy until the survivors remembered their place. Alduin sent his strongest lieutenants to crush the growing defiance. He sent Odahviin the Red to scorch the western settlements. He sent Durnavir to raise the dead from their graves to fight against their own grandchildren. He sent Salamir to the mountain passes where rebels were rumored to hide. But something had changed in the mortals. They no longer scattered when dragons approached. They no longer threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. Instead, they dug pits and covered them with branches. They forged chains from the iron they had previously used to make offerings. They studied the patterns of dragon flight and learned where the scales were thinnest. They were still losing. They were losing badly, but they were learning how to fight back. The turning point came not from the mortals, but from the dragons themselves. Paarthurnax had been watching the rebellion grow for decades. He had watched Alduin's response. He had seen the burnings and the slaughters and the calculated cruelty meant to break spirits. And somewhere in the process of watching, something shifted in him. He began to see the mortals not as insects to be managed, but as beings capable of choice, capable of sacrifice, capable of dying for something they believed in. Paarthurnax made a decision that would fracture reality itself. He descended from the throat of the world and sought out the leaders of the rebellion. 3 humans who had survived longer than any others. 3 warriors who had learned to move between the dragon patrols like ghosts. He landed before them, and they prepared to die. Instead, he spoke to them in their own language. He told them he would teach them the Thoum. The warriors thought it was a trap. Dragons did not betray their own kind. Dragons did not share the voice with mortals. The voice was sacred. It was the language of creation. It was the power that separated gods from cattle. Paarthurnax understood their doubt. He told them he would prove his sincerity. He told them to choose a target, any target, and he would help them kill it. They chose a dragon priest named Havenorak. He ruled over a territory where children were taken from their families at age 5 to be trained as soldiers in the dragon armies. These children grew up, knowing no parents but the priests, no loyalty but to their scaled masters. Helgen was careful, paranoid. He slept in a chamber that could only be accessed by flight. He wore enchanted armor that turned away arrows and blades. Parthenax taught the three warriors the first word of unrelenting force. It took them months to learn. Their throats bled from the attempts. Their voices gave out and recovered and gave out again. But slowly, they shaped the sound. Slowly, they learned to channel their will through their breath. And when they finally spoke the word successfully, a training dummy 20 feet away exploded into splinters. They practiced in secret caves that Parthenax showed them. Caves that existed in pockets of reality where dragon sight could not reach. Ancient places that predated even the Merithic era. Places where the walls hummed with residual power from conflicts so old that no living thing remembered them. In these caves, the three warriors became something new, something that had never existed before. They became mortal voices carrying divine language. The attack on Helgen happened on a night when 3 moons hung in the sky. The warriors climbed to the roof of his temple using ropes and determination. When the dragon priest emerged for his nightly patrol, they spoke the word in unison. The force caught him mid-flight and slammed him into the temple wall. His mask cracked. His armor shattered. And before he could recover, they were on him with blades forged from the melted chains that had once bound their people. Helgen died slowly. He died confused. He died asking how mortals could possibly wield the voice. He died without receiving an answer, because the warriors had no words to explain what they themselves barely understood. They took his mask as proof. They brought it back to their people. And when the people saw that mask covered in blood, when they understood that a dragon priest had fallen to mortal hands, something ignited that would never be extinguished. The rebellion exploded across every territory. Temples were stormed, priests were dragged from their chambers and torn apart by crowds who had centuries of rage to express. Some priests tried to surrender. Some begged for mercy. They received the same mercy they had shown, which is to say, they received none at all. The violence was not righteous. It was not clean. It was the violence of the oppressed, finally granted the means to strike back. Alduin felt his empire crumbling and could not understand how. He flew to confront Parthenax. The confrontation happened at the peak of the throat of the world, where the air was too thin for mortals to survive. Alduin demanded to know why his brother had committed this betrayal. Parthenax gave an answer that Alduin could not process. He said that the mortals deserved the chance to rule themselves. That domination was not the same as order. That fear was not the same as respect. Alduin called him weak, called him corrupted by mortal thinking, called him a traitor to their father's design. Parthenax accepted all these accusations without defense. He said that perhaps he was all those things, but he was also certain that what they had built was wrong, that power without consent was tyranny, that tyranny always falls eventually, and that it was better to step aside than to be dragged down when the collapse came. The two dragons fought, brother against brother. The fight shook mountains and boiled lakes. It created storms that raged for weeks. Parthenax was strong, but Alduin was stronger, had always been stronger, was born to be stronger. Because he was the firstborn and the World-Eater. The fight ended with Parthenax bleeding from a dozen wounds and Alduin preparing to deliver the killing blow. But Parthenax had not fought to win. He had fought to buy time. While the dragons above raged against each other, the 3 mortal warriors had climbed the mountain. They had climbed despite the cold that froze their blood, despite the altitude that made their lungs scream, despite knowing they would likely die. They climbed because Parzanax had taught them the words they needed. All the words, the complete shout that would change everything. When they reached the summit, they saw Alduin standing over Parzanax. They saw the World-Eater raise his head to deliver the final strike. And in that moment, with the last air in their burning lungs, they screamed the words that Parzanax had given them. They screamed Dragonrend. The shout was not like other shouts. It was not force or fire or frost. It was concept-made sound. It was the idea of mortality compressed into 3 words of power. It was the understanding of death wrapped in the Thu'um and hurled like a spear. When it struck Alduin, something happened that had never happened before. The World-Eater, who had existed since time began, who would exist until time ended, suddenly understood what it meant to die. Alduin crashed to the ground, not from physical force, but from psychological weight. For the first time in his infinite existence, he felt fear, real fear. Not concern or caution, but the primal animal terror of ceasing to be. He felt his consciousness flickering like a candle flame in wind. He felt the possibility of non-existence pressing down on him, and in that moment of vulnerability, he understood what every mortal understood from their first breath, that everything ends. The 3 warriors attacked while Alduin was grounded. Their blades cut scales that should have been impenetrable. Their strikes drew blood that should have been impossible to spill. Alduin thrashed and roared and tried to take flight, but Dragonrend held him down, held him in mortality, forced him to experience limitation for the first time. He was still powerful, still dangerous, but he was no longer invincible. The battle raged for hours. The warriors were joined by others who had climbed the mountain, more mortals wielding the voice, more rebels who had learned the words from Parzanax, or from the original 3. They surrounded Alduin like wolves bringing down prey, too large for any single hunter. They struck and retreated, wore him down, made him bleed, made him tired, made him feel exhaustion. But they could not make him die. No matter how many wounds they inflicted, Alduin healed. His flesh knit back together. His blood stopped flowing. He was weakening, but not dying. And slowly, the warriors realized the horrible truth. Alduin was the World-Eater. He was the end of the Kalpa cycle. He was destruction personified. You cannot kill destruction. You cannot end the concept of ending. He was beyond death, because he was death's master. One of the 3 original warriors was named Feldir. He was older than the others. He had lived long enough to see 3 generations of his family die under dragon rule. He had climbed this mountain, knowing he would not climb back down. He carried with him an object he had stolen from a dragon priest's vault decades earlier. An elder scroll. A fragment of reality so dense with possibility that looking at it could drive mortals mad. The Feldir unrolled the scroll, despite the protests of the others. The scroll showed him everything. Every timeline, every possibility, every version of this moment across infinite variations of existence. He saw futures where Alduin won, futures where the mortals won, futures where everyone died and the world ended anyway. He saw the weight of causality itself, and it broke something in his mind that would never heal. But in that breaking, Feldir found an answer. Alduin could not be killed, but he could be removed. Time was not a line but a river, and rivers could be dammed, could be redirected, could be made to flow in ways that nature never intended. The Elder Scroll could cut Alduin out of this moment and cast him forward into an age not yet born. It would not kill him, but it would give the world a chance to prepare. Feldir read from the scroll. The words were not in any language. They were mathematics. They were the underlying code of existence made visible. As he read, time began to tear. A wound opened in the fabric of the present moment. Through that wound, they could see glimpses of a future. Snow falling on ruins, dragons extinct, an empire risen and fallen, and risen again. A world that had forgotten this battle. A world that thought dragons were legend. Alduin felt the pull of the time wound and understood what was happening. He roared in rage and desperation. He called for his lieutenants, but they were scattered across Skyrim, fighting their own battles. He called for Parthernax, but his brother turned away. He called for mercy, but the mortals had none to give. The wound pulled him forward, pulled him out of now and into then. The last thing Alduin saw before time swallowed him was the faces of the mortals who had defeated him. Not with strength, not with magic, but with stubbornness, with refusal to accept that their place was beneath anyone's heel. He saw in their eyes something that terrified him more than the time wound. He saw certainty. The certainty that even if he returned, even if he came back stronger, they would fight again. Their children would fight. Their children's children would fight. Mortality was not weakness. It was fuel for a rage that could burn across generations. Then he was gone. The time wound sealed behind him. The mountain fell silent except for the sound of warriors breathing hard and fast. Feldir collapsed. The scroll had stolen his sight. His eyes remained open but saw nothing except the infinite possibilities he had witnessed. The other two warriors, Hakon and Gormlaith, knelt beside him. They had won, but the victory felt hollow. Parthernax told them what they already understood. Alduin was not dead, could not die, would return when the time wound delivered him to the future. But that future was far away. Far enough that these warriors would be dust. Far enough that their grandchildren would be legend. The fight was over, but the war would continue. Just not in this age. The three warriors descended the mountain. Feldir went blind. Gormlaith's voice was destroyed from using the thome. Hakon's legs were frostbitten beyond saving. They had sacrificed their bodies to buy the future, a chance. They did not know if the future would use that chance wisely. They only knew they had done what they could. Sometimes that has to be enough. Word spread across Skyrim that Alduin had fallen. The dragon priests who survived went into hiding. The temples were torn down stone by stone. The masks were collected and sealed in vaults where they would hopefully never be found. The dragons scattered to the edges of the world. Some fled to other continents. Some buried themselves in ancient tombs and entered hibernation. All of them understood that the age of their dominion had ended. The Nords celebrated for a year. They built monuments to the fallen. They composed songs about the heroes who had climbed the mountain. They told stories that would become legends, that would become myths. They promised themselves they would never forget. They swore their children would remember, that future generations would remain vigilant. But mortals are very good at forgetting. Within a century, the Dragon War became history. Within 2 centuries, it became legend. Within 3, it became myth. The temples were buried under landslides or reclaimed by forest. The dragon burial mounds were marked with standing stones that weather slowly eroded. The language of dragons was preserved by the Greybeards, but forbidden to common people. The Thu'um became a thing of monks and hermits, not warriors. The empire that rose from the ashes of the dragon cult had no use for old warnings. They were too busy building roads and establishing trade routes and conquering neighbors. They created laws and systems. They built cities that made the dragon temples look primitive. They convinced themselves that civilization had moved beyond superstition, that dragons were stories told to frighten children. Paarthurnax remained on the throat of the world. He meditated on what he had done, on the betrayal of his own kind, on whether he had been right or merely different. The Greybeards found him there and learned from him. They built their monastery on the slopes of the mountain. They preserved the way of the voice, but taught it as philosophy, as meditation, not as weapon. The dragons who remained in Skyrim went into hiding so deep that even they forgot why they were hiding. They slept in barrows covered by centuries of dirt. They dreamed dragon dreams of fire and conquest. Some of them forgot they were dragons at all. They became part of the landscape, bones buried so long, they turned to stone. But in the deepest part of those dreams, in the darkest corner of draconic consciousness, there remained an awareness, a certainty, that Alduin would return, that the World-Eater could not be kept away forever, that time was a circle and circles always complete themselves. The dragons did not know when he would return. They only knew that they would know when it happened, that every dragon everywhere would feel it, when their father came back. The prophecy was carved into Skyhaven Temple before the temple was finished. The last Dragonborn will rise when the World-Eater returns. The prophecy did not say the Dragonborn would win, did not promise victory, only stated that when one appeared, the other would follow, that there would be a confrontation, that the fate of the world would hang on the outcome. Centuries passed. The temple was abandoned. The prophecy was forgotten. The blades who guarded it transformed into something else. The world moved on because the world always moves on. Mountains erode. Rivers change course. Empires rise and fall and rise again. Nothing stays the same, except the prophecy. And prophecies have a way of fulfilling themselves, whether anyone remembers them or not. In the depths of the time-wound Alduin drifted, not awake, not asleep, existing in the space between moments. He could feel the future approaching, could feel himself being carried toward it like debris in a flood. He could not stop it, could not change course, could only wait for the moment when time would spit him back out into a world that had forgotten him. And in that forgetting, the world had made a terrible mistake, because the only thing more dangerous than a monster everyone fears is a monster no one believes in. Fear makes people careful, makes them prepare, makes them watch the shadows. But disbelief makes people careless, makes them ignore warning signs, makes them build their homes on ground that should be considered haunted. Skyrim rebuilt itself on top of dragon graves, planted crops in soil fertilized by the ashes of dragon temples, raised children who played games about slaying dragons without understanding their grandparents had actually done it. The memory faded, the vigilance faded, and in that fading, the world became vulnerable in a way it had not been for thousands of years. The stage was set. The pieces were in place. The time wound was nearly ready to deliver its cargo. All that remained was for someone to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, for a prisoner to be scheduled for execution on a day when the sky would tear open, for prophecy to collide with coincidence, and create the kind of moment that historians would argue about for ages. The world thought it was safe. The world thought the past was dead and buried. The world was wrong, and it was about to be reminded that some debts are never truly paid, some enemies never truly die, some wars never truly end. They just pause. They wait. They gather strength in the darkness, and when they return hungry. The Fourth Era began with optimism. The Empire had stabilized after the Oblivion Crisis. Trade routes were secure. Crops grew well. People built homes and raised families and worried about ordinary things like taxes and weather. The concerns of mortals living mortal lives in a world that seemed predictable. The dragons were stories. The dragon war was ancient history. The prophecies were forgotten, ramblings of dead priests. In the town of Helgen, near the southern border of Skyrim, a captain of the Imperial Legion prepared for a routine execution. Stormcloak rebels had been captured, some horse thieves, a few bandits, the kind of criminals that every garrison dealt with regularly. The executions were scheduled for morning, clean, efficient, public enough to serve as warning, but not so public as to cause unrest. Just another day in the slow grind of maintaining order. The prisoners were brought to the block in wagons. Among them was someone who should not have been there. Someone caught in the wrong place during the ambush. Someone whose only crime was bad timing. The prisoner had no name that mattered to history yet. No reputation, no legend. Just another face in a wagon full of the condemned. The captain did not care about innocence or guilt. The list said, execute. So execution would happen. The headsman prepared his axe. The priestess of Arche said her prayers for the dead and dying. The imperial soldiers stood at attention. The townspeople gathered to watch because executions were entertainment in small towns where nothing else ever happened. A child asked her mother why the people in the wagon looked so scared. The mother told her to hush and watch. Lessons were important even when the lessons were cruel. The sky that morning was strange. Gray, but not with clouds. Heavy, but not with rain. The air tasted metallic. Several soldiers commented on it, but dismissed the feeling as nerves or bad breakfast. One of the guards looked up and saw birds flying south in formations too large for the season. He mentioned it to his commanding officer, who told him to focus on the task at hand. Birds were not his concern. The prisoners were. The first Stormcloak was brought to the block. He gave a speech about Skyrim belonging to the Nords, about the Empire being weak, about Talos and honor and freedom. The headsman let him finish, because even condemned men deserve their final words. Then the axe fell. The body was dragged aside. The blood soaked into dirt that had absorbed blood before and would again. One death among thousands, unremarkable, forgotten before the corpse cooled. The next prisoner was called forward. The nameless one. The one who did not belong on the list, but was on it anyway because bureaucracy cares more about paperwork than justice. As the prisoner knelt at the block, as the headsman raised his axe, the sky tore open. It was not a gradual darkening, not clouds rolling in, or storm approaching. It was instant, absolute. A shadow passed overhead so large that it blocked out the sun completely. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 5 seconds. The horses began screaming, not neighing, screaming. The sound horses make when they smell predators so far above them on the food chain that every instinct demands immediate flight. The creature that landed on the tower was black, like the bottom of the ocean. Black like the space between stars. Black like the absence of light given physical form. Its wings, when they spread, blotted out half the town. Its eyes burned red like coals pulled fresh from forge. When it opened its mouth, the sound that emerged was not a roar. It was the voice, the thoth, the thone. Language made weapon. Concept made destruction. The word it spoke meant fire, but not ordinary fire. This was the fire from the heart of the world. The fire that burns without fuel and consumes without ash. The watchtower exploded. Stone melted. Wood turned to vapor. The soldiers on top had just enough time to understand they were dying before they ceased to exist. The prisoner at the block felt heat wash over, like standing too close to an oven. The rope binding wrists burned away to nothing. Chaos erupted. The kind of chaos that happens when a population realizes that every assumption they held about reality was wrong. Dragons were not myth. Dragons were here. Dragon was standing on the ruins of the tower, eating a horse whole. The Imperial soldiers tried to form ranks, tried to establish some kind of defensive position, but they were trained to fight men, trained to hold shield walls against arrows and swords. No one had trained them how to fight a creature that could incinerate an entire formation with a single word. The captain screamed orders that no one followed, because following orders requires belief that orders matter. When a dragon is eating your fellow soldiers in front of you, orders stop mattering. Survival becomes the only order. Run or die, hide or burn, every person for themselves. The formation broke. The soldiers scattered. The townspeople fled into buildings that would become tombs. The dragon moved through Helgen like a natural disaster given purpose. It burned homes, crushed walls, tore roofs from buildings, and exposed the people hiding inside. It was methodical, thorough, not frenzied or random. It moved like something following a pattern, like something clearing obstacles, like something searching for something specific, but willing to destroy everything else along the way. The nameless prisoner ran, survival instinct overwhelming everything else, through burning streets, over corpses of people who had been alive moments before. The heat was suffocating. The smoke made breathing like inhaling knives. Buildings collapsed. Walls fell. The geography of the town rearranged itself in real time as dragon fire melted stone and wood into slag. In the chaos, there were moments of terrible clarity. A child crying for a mother who was ash. A soldier trying to pull a beam off his trapped companion while fire crept closer. A priest of Arche still holding her holy symbol and praying even as flames consumed the chapel around her. These moments burned themselves into memory, the kind of memory that wakes you screaming decades later. The dragon spoke again. This time the word meant frost. The air crystallized. Moisture in the air became ice crystals that fell like snow made from razors. The fire it had created moments before was smothered under glacial cold. The temperature swung from unbearable heat to bone-cracking freeze in seconds. Bodies that had been burning froze mid-combustion. Steam rose from every surface as heat met cold, and neither won. The prisoner found shelter in a keep. Others had the same idea. Stormcloaks and Imperials huddling together because enemy was a concept that meant nothing when something worse than enemy was outside destroying everything. They barricaded the door, caught their breath, tried to process what was happening. One of the Stormcloaks said it was divine punishment for the execution. One of the Imperials said it was an attack from the Aldmeri Dominion using unknown magic. Everyone else said nothing because words felt useless. Then the dragon landed on the keep. The entire building shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. Cracks appeared in the walls. They heard it moving above them, heard talons scraping stone, heard breathing, heard the low rumble that dragons make when they are thinking, when they are deciding, when they are choosing what to destroy next. It burned through the roof. Not with fire this time, but with raw force. The thone shaped into battering ram. The roof caved in. Timbers fell. One crushed a soldier, whose name the prisoner never learned. Blood everywhere. Screaming, the dragon's head appeared in the hole it had created. Those red eyes scanning, searching. It made eye contact with the prisoner. Held that contact for 3 heartbeats. Then it pulled back and flew away. The prisoner did not understand the significance of that moment, would not understand for weeks. But the dragon had found what it was looking for, had confirmed something, had checked a detail that mattered for reasons beyond mortal comprehension. The eye contact was recognition. The dragon knew, and in knowing, it chose to let the prisoner live. For now, the survivors fled through the keep, found tunnels underneath, tunnels that ran beneath the town, and came out in caves beyond the walls. They moved through darkness, broken only by torchlight. Behind them, they heard the continued destruction, buildings falling, dragon roaring, the death of an entire community happening in the span of minutes. When they emerged from the caves, they looked back at Helgen. The town was gone, not damaged, not burned, gone, reduced to rubble and ash. Smoke rose in columns that could be seen for miles. The dragon circled overhead once, then it flew north, toward the throat of the world, toward the highest peak in Skyrim. It flew with purpose, with destination. It was not wandering. It knew where it was going. The survivors split up. Stormcloaks went one direction. Imperials went another. The prisoner went a third direction, toward Riverwood, toward anywhere that was not here, toward distance from the memory of what just happened. The legs carried the body because the mind was too overwhelmed to send coherent signals, one foot in front of the other, breathing, moving, surviving. In the days that followed, reports came from across Skyrim. A dragon had been sighted near Whiterun, another near Winterhold, a third over the Sea of Ghosts. The ancient burial mounds were opening. Dragons were emerging from graves where they had slept for millennia. The sky was no longer safe. Farmers stayed inside. Travel ceased. Markets emptied. Fear spread faster than any dragon could fly. The Jarl of Whiterun sent soldiers to investigate the western watchtower. They arrived to find it burning. A dragon perched atop it like a bird on a fence post. The dragon saw the soldiers and attacked, not with fire, but with frost that froze men solid before they could draw weapons. The few survivors retreated and brought word back to the Jarl. Dragons were not isolated incidents. They were coordinated, organized, led by something or someone. The prisoner arrived in Riverwood and tried to explain what happened. The locals did not want to believe. Dragons were extinct. Everyone knew this. But the smoke from Helgen was visible even from this distance, and the prisoner's eyes held a kind of horror that could not be faked. The kind of horror that comes from watching the world end and somehow surviving it. The locals began preparing, reinforcing walls, stockpiling weapons, sending riders to warn other towns. At the throat of the world, in the ruins of ancient temples, where the dragon war had ended 3,000 years before, Alduin stood. He had returned to the place of his banishment, had felt the pull of this mountain since the moment time released him. He spoke to the stones, spoke to the wind, spoke to the bones buried beneath snow and ice. He called his children, called the dragons who had served him before, called them to wake and rise and remember what they were. The dragons heard, in their tombs, in their caves, in the deep places where they had hidden from mortal vengeance. They heard their father's voice and could not resist. One by one they tore themselves from centuries of sleep, shook off the dirt and stone, remembered flight, remembered fire, remembered when they ruled and mortals cowered. The old rage returned, the old hunger, the old certainty that the world belonged to them by right of power. But Alduin had changed. The banishment had twisted something in him. He was supposed to be the World-Eater, the end of the Kalpa cycle, the reset button that cleansed reality so it could begin anew. That was his purpose, his divine mandate. But the mortals had denied him that purpose, had cast him forward through time, had robbed him of his role, and in that robbery something had broken. He no longer cared about his purpose, no longer wanted to serve as the ending. He wanted revenge, wanted to make the descendants of those who banished him understand what they had done, wanted to rebuild his empire, wanted to hear mortals pray to him, not because they believed, but because they were too terrified to do anything else. He had abandoned his cosmic duty in favor of petty tyranny. The World-Eater had become merely a conqueror. This corruption of purpose was the crack in his armor, the weakness that prophecy could exploit. Alduin the World-Eater was invincible, was beyond death, was necessary to the function of reality. But Alduin the Conqueror was just powerful, just dangerous, just another tyrant who could be fought. The betrayal of his purpose was the thread that could unravel him. He did not understand this yet, would not understand until too late. The prisoner traveled to Whiterun, brought warning to the Jarl, told the story of Helgen. The Jarl listened because the prisoner's words matched the reports from his guards. He sent the prisoner to help defend the Western Watchtower, not because the prisoner was a warrior, but because every hand was needed. Because dragons did not care about skill. They killed trained soldiers and untrained farmers with equal ease. The Watchtower was already under attack when the prisoner arrived. A dragon named Murmelnir circled overhead, bronze scales catching sunlight, voice shaking the stones. The guards were holding but barely. Arrows bounced off scales. Swords could not reach high enough. The dragon landed and the real fighting began. Close quarters, tooth and claw against shield and spear, blood on both sides, death on both sides. The prisoner fought because there was no choice. Survival again, always survival. A guard went down. The prisoner picked up his sword, swung at the dragon's exposed throat. The blade connected, drew blood. The dragon roared and backhanded the prisoner 20 feet, landing hurt. Ribs cracked, vision blurred, but the dragon was injured too, bleeding, slowing. The guards pressed the advantage. Coordinated strikes, stab and retreat. Wear it down. The dragon grew weaker, its movements less precise, its fire less intense. Finally it collapsed. Still breathing, but unable to rise, the guards prepared to finish it. The prisoner stood and walked toward the dying creature, not from courage, from something else, from compulsion that made no sense. The dragon looked at the prisoner, recognition in those fading eyes. It spoke in the dragon tongue, spoke one word, Duvakin. The prisoner did not understand, did not speak that language, had never heard it before. But something in the prisoner's blood understood, something ancient, something that had been sleeping. The dragon died. Its flesh began to burn, not from fire but from within. The scales turned to ash, the bones turned to light. The essence of what made it a dragon separated from the physical form. That essence rose like smoke, swirled in the air. Then it rushed toward the prisoner, entered through skin, through breath, through every pore. The prisoner screamed as something foreign and massive forced its way into a space too small to contain it. Knowledge flooded in. Memories that were not the prisoner's memories. Sensation of flight. Taste of Thuum on tongue. The weight of centuries. The pride of being apex predator. The rage of being brought down by insects. All of it compressing into the prisoner's consciousness, rewriting neural pathways, changing chemistry, altering fundamental nature. The guards saw light, saw the prisoner glowing like a lantern, saw the dragon's body reduced to ash and bone. One guard said the word that everyone was thinking, Dragonborn, the last Dragonborn, the one from prophecy, the one who could absorb dragon souls, the one who was supposed to face Alduin when the World-Eater returned. The prisoner did not feel like prophecy, felt like confusion and pain, and an overwhelming urge to scream. The scream, built in the chest, rose through the throat, emerged as something more than sound. The prisoner spoke a word, Thoth, force. The word had power, had weight. The shout physically pushed the air. knocked over a barrel 30 feet away. The guard stumbled back. The prisoner stared at hands that suddenly seemed capable of impossible things. Before anyone could process what happened, thunder rolled across the mountain. Not storm, thunder. Deeper, older. The graybeards were calling. Their voices shaped the Thoum into summons. They called from High Hrothgar, called the Dragonborn to come to them. Called because they had felt the absorption of the dragon soul. Called because prophecy was manifesting whether anyone was ready or not. The Jarl dismissed the prisoner, said that if the graybeards called, the only option was to answer. Gave supplies, gave coin, gave blessing. The prisoner left Whiterun, not understanding what was happening, only knowing that something fundamental had changed, that the dragon's death had awakened something, that dormant power now surged through veins that were still mortal, but carried something ancient and terrible. The climb to High Hrothgar took days. The path wound up the mountain in switchbacks that grew steeper with each turn. The air thinned. The temperature dropped. Snow that never melted covered everything above a certain elevation. Other pilgrims had tried this journey. Their frozen corpses marked spots where the climb proved too much. The prisoner passed these markers and continued climbing. The monastery appeared through the snow. 7,000 steps led to its gate. The steps were carved into the mountain itself. Each step a meditation, each climb a prayer. The prisoner climbed them all, legs burning, lungs screaming. But something drove onward. The power absorbed from the dragon seemed to help, seemed to make the impossible merely difficult. The graybeards met the prisoner at the gate. 4 old men who had devoted their entire lives to mastering the voice, who spoke in whispers because their full voices could shatter stone. They tested the prisoner, spoke words that the prisoner should not be able to understand, should not be able to repeat. But the prisoner repeated them perfectly, without training, because dragon souls carry dragon knowledge. Because Dragonborn means dragon blood in mortal flesh. They were taught the first real lessons. How to focus the voice. How to shape breath into power. How to speak words that make reality. Listen. The prisoner learned faster than any student they had ever taught. What took them years, took hours. What took them decades, took days. This was not mortal learning. This was remembering. The dragon soul, providing templates, providing instinct. One graybeard, named Arngir, explained what Dragonborn meant, explained the prophecy, explained that Alduin had returned, that dragons were rising across Skyrim, that the prisoner was the only one who could truly kill them, because only Dragonborn could absorb dragon souls. Only Dragonborn could prevent dragons from being resurrected by Alduin's power. Only Dragonborn could face the World-Eater and have any chance of victory. The prisoner wanted to refuse, wanted to say this was a mistake, that there must be someone else, someone trained, someone prepared, someone who actually wanted this responsibility. But prophecy does not care about want, does not care about readiness. It simply is. The prisoner was Dragonborn, therefore the prisoner would face Alduin. The only question was when. Arngir sent the prisoner to meet Parthurnax, the dragon who lived at the peak of the throat of the world, the dragon who had betrayed Alduin 3,000 years before, the dragon who had taught mortals the voice. He lived there still, meditating, waiting, knowing that eventually someone would need to climb that final distance. The climb to the peak was worse than the climb to High Hrothgar. The path disappeared in places. Ice covered everything, wind strong enough to knock a grown man off the mountain. The prisoner climbed anyway, used the voice to clear paths, used Dragonborn strength to pull up where mortals would fall. reached the summit where air was so thin that each breath felt like drowning. Parthurnax waited there, ancient beyond reckoning, scales gray with age, eyes holding wisdom and regret in equal measure. He was not hostile, was not aggressive. He simply watched as the prisoner approached. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. He spoke in the language of mortals out of courtesy, asked the prisoner what they knew of their own nature. The prisoner knew very little, knew only what the graybeards had explained. Parthurnax filled in the gaps, explained what it meant to have dragon soul in mortal body, explained that dragons never truly die unless their souls are absorbed, that Alduin could resurrect any dragon whose soul remained, that this power made him nearly impossible to defeat, that the prisoner was the counterbalance, the piece that made the fight possible if not likely. He taught the prisoner Dragonrend, the shout that forced immortal beings to comprehend mortality, the weapon that the ancient heroes had used. 3 words that together became concept, made weapon. Jor-Zafrul, mortal, finite, temporary. When spoken with power, these words forced the target to experience limitation, to feel the walls of existence closing in, to understand ending. Learning Dragonrend hurt. The words fought against being learned. Dragons were immortal. Dragonborn had dragon souls. Teaching immortal souls to comprehend mortality created cognitive dissonance that manifested as physical pain. The prisoner's nose bled. Vision doubled. Mind rejected the concept even as it absorbed the knowledge. But eventually the words settled, found their place, became available to be spoken. Parthurnax warned that using Dragonrend would change the prisoner, that forcing yourself to comprehend mortality while wielding immortal power created contradiction, that the prisoner would never feel fully mortal or fully dragon again, would exist in between, forever split, forever carrying both natures and unable to fully embrace either. The prisoner accepted this, had no choice but to accept. The path forward required finding the blades, the ancient order that had once been called Dragon God. They had knowledge, they had resources, they had spent centuries preparing for a dragon threat that everyone else dismissed as paranoia. The prisoner, now understanding their role as Dragonborn, sought them in the ruins of their former glory, found them hiding, found them reduced to 2 survivors clinging to purpose in a world that had forgotten why their order existed. Delphine ran an inn in Riverwood. She poured drinks and cleaned rooms and pretended to be ordinary while maintaining a secret basement full of weapons and maps. She had been watching for signs, had been tracking rumors of dragons when everyone else dismissed them as superstition. When the Dragonborn arrived asking questions, she knew immediately what they were, recognized the way they moved, the way they spoke, the weight they carried, that had nothing to do with physical burden. She took the Dragonborn to her basement, showed them the wall covered in reports spanning decades, sightings that turned out to be nothing, legends that led nowhere, dead ends, and false hopes documented in meticulous detail. But now the reports were real. Dragons were confirmed. Her life's work was validated in the worst possible way. She had been right, and being right meant the world was ending. Esbern was harder to find. He hid in the sewers beneath Riften, had been hiding for years from Thalmor assassins who wanted to eliminate anyone who remembered the old ways. He lived in a room behind a barricaded door, surrounded by books, ancient texts, forbidden knowledge, things the Thalmor had tried very hard to erase from history. He had preserved it all, had become a living library of dragon lore. When Delphine and the Dragonborn broke through his barricade, Esbern thought they were assassins, nearly killed them before recognizing Delphine. When he learned about the Dragonborn, when he understood that prophecy was manifesting, Something broke in him. Not in a bad way. In the way that happens when someone who has been holding tension for decades finally gets permission to release it. He wept. Then he gathered his most important books and followed them out of the sewers. They traveled to Skyhaven Temple, an ancient Blades fortress hidden in the Reach, built into a mountainside, sealed for centuries. The entrance was hidden behind a puzzle that required dragon blood to open. The Dragonborn cut their palm and pressed it to the stone. The mechanism activated. Gears that had not moved in 300 years ground to life. The door opened, revealing darkness that smelled of dust and time. Inside they found Alduin's wall, a massive carved mural depicting the entire history of the Dragon War. Every important moment captured in stone. The rise of the dragon cult, the rebellion, the three heroes, the banishment, and at the end, the prophecy, the last Dragonborn, facing Alduin in final confrontation. The outcome was not depicted. The wall showed the moment of clash, but not the resolution. Because prophecy shows what will happen, but never guarantees how it ends. Esbern translated the portions written in dragon tongue. He explained that Alduin was not just gathering dragons, he was rebuilding his power base, resurrecting ancient lieutenants from their burial mounds, bringing back the dragons who had been most loyal, most vicious, most effective at keeping mortals terrified. The process took time. Each resurrection required Alduin to visit the burial site personally, to speak the words that called soul back to bone. This gave the Dragonborn opportunity. Hunt the dragons as they rose, absorb their souls before Alduin could resurrect them again, weaken his forces, reduce his army, make the final confrontation more survivable. It was not a good plan, but it was the only plan, so the hunt began. The Dragonborn traveled across Skyrim, tracking dragon sightings. Each encounter was different. Each dragon had personality, history. Some were young and reckless. They fought with rage and died confused. Some were ancient and cunning. They fought with strategy and died cursing. Some tried to flee when they realized what the Dragonborn was. None of them escaped. The Dragonborn had become efficient, had learned to read flight patterns, to predict the Thum usage, to exploit the moment between breaths when even dragons are vulnerable. With each absorbed soul, the Dragonborn changed, grew stronger, learned new shouts without being taught. The knowledge simply appeared, words of power emerging from the collective memory of dead dragons. But the changes were not just power. The Dragonborn began to think differently, began to see mortals as fragile, began to feel the dragon pride creeping in, the sense that being able to kill something meant having the right to kill it. Paarthurnax had warned about this, about the dragon nature overwhelming the mortal nature, about power corrupting not through moral failure, but through simple change in perspective. When you can destroy cities with your voice, when you can absorb the life force of beings that have existed for millennia, when you stand above everyone and everything, humility becomes difficult. Empathy becomes abstract. The Dragonborn felt this happening and could not stop it, could only acknowledge it, and try to remember who they had been before the power. Delphine wanted to kill Paarthurnax. She argued that he was a dragon, that dragons could not be trusted, that his betrayal of Alduin 3,000 years ago did not erase what he had done before that betrayal. She was not wrong. Paarthurnax had been part of the dragon cult, had enforced Alduin's rule, had blood on his claws that would never wash clean. But he had also spent 3,000 years meditating on his nature, fighting against dragon instinct, teaching the way of the voice as philosophy rather than weapon. The Dragonborn refused to kill him. This created tension with the blades, created a rift that would not heal. Delphine said that if the Dragonborn would not follow orders, the blades could not serve them. The Dragonborn accepted this, chose wisdom over blind loyalty, chose to believe that redemption was possible, even for monsters. The decision felt right, but also felt like losing something important. The last connection to an ancient order severed because of principles. Neither side would compromise. The hunt continued alone. Dragon after dragon falling, souls absorbed, power growing. But Alduin remained distant. He did not engage directly, did not risk himself in combat with the one being who could permanently end him. He stayed at the throat of the world, protected by his strongest lieutenants, surrounded by dragons who would die before letting anyone reach him. The Dragonborn could kill dragons all day, but could not reach the source. Esbern suggested a different approach. Capture a dragon, force it to reveal Alduin's plans, learn how to reach him. The idea seemed impossible until the Dragonborn remembered Dragon's Reach, the palace in Whiterun. It was called Dragon's Reach because it had been built specifically to hold a dragon centuries ago. The trap still existed, the great porch with the reinforced pillars, the chains forged from materials strong enough to hold scaled flesh. The Jarl of Whiterun resisted. Allowing a dragon into the city was insane, but the Dragonborn explained that insanity was their only remaining option, that conventional approaches had failed, that desperate times required desperate measures. The Jarl agreed with reluctance, agreed because the alternative was waiting for Alduin to finish gathering his forces and then facing him at full strength. At least this plan offered action. The Dragonborn went to the throat of the world, called out to the dragons circling the peak, challenged them in dragon tongue, called them cowards, called them slaves, used the dragon pride against them. Eventually one took the bait. A dragon named Odaving, red scales, battle-scarred, old enough to remember the dragon war. He dove from the peak and pursued the Dragonborn back to Whiterun. The fight above the city was witnessed by everyone. Dragon and Dragonborn exchanging Thu'um, fire against force, frost against unrelenting voice. The sky became a battleground. Buildings shook from the impacts. People hid in their homes and prayed. The guards on the walls could only watch. Their weapons were useless at these heights. This was combat beyond mortal participation. The Dragonborn led Odaving to Dragon's Reach. Landed on the great porch. The dragon followed. Landed in the exact spot where the trap had been built. The guards pulled chains. The trap activated. Reinforced steel, wrapped around neck and wings and legs. Odaving thrashed, roared, tried to break free. The chains held, barely, but they held. The interrogation was not gentle. Odaving resisted at first, claimed loyalty to Alduin, claimed that the World-Eater was inevitable, that fighting him was fighting the end of the cycle itself. The Dragonborn asked questions, used dragon language, used the authority that came from absorbed souls. Slowly, Odaving began to talk, not from torture, from respect. The Dragonborn had proven strong, proven capable. Dragons respected strength above all else. Odaving revealed that Alduin was not in this world anymore. He had fled to Sovngarde, the Nordic afterlife, the Hall of Valor, where fallen warriors feasted eternally. Alduin had gone there to feed on the souls of dead heroes. Each soul he consumed made him stronger. He was preparing for the final confrontation by devouring the essence of the bravest mortals who ever lived, making himself invincible by eating courage itself. This was worse than anything the Dragonborn had imagined. Sovngarde was supposed to be sacred, the reward for Nordic warriors who died with honor. They were supposed to feast and fight and celebrate for eternity. Instead, they were being hunted, consumed, erased from existence, not just killed, but unmade. Their eternal reward stolen by the creature they had fought to banish. The only way to reach Sovngarde was through a portal at Skuldafn, an ancient temple perched on a peak, accessible only by flight. Odahviing offered a deal. Release him and he would carry the Dragonborn to Skuldafn. Not from kindness, from pragmatism. Alduin had abandoned his role as World-Eater, had become obsessed with conquest and revenge. This made him unworthy, made him a false leader. Odahviing served strength. If the Dragonborn was stronger, then the Dragonborn deserved to lead. The Dragonborn accepted, released the chains, climbed onto Odahviing's back. The feeling of flying was like the absorbed memories suggested, wind and freedom and perspective that made ground-bound existence seem small. They flew north, over mountains and valleys, over forests that looked like moss from this height, over the ruins of civilization that thought it mattered. Skuldafn was defended. Dragon priests rose from their tombs. Draugr warriors animated by ancient magic stumbled from barrows. The temple itself seemed to resist intrusion. The stones hummed with wards placed millennia ago. The Dragonborn fought through all of it, used every shout learned, used every trick, absorbed from dragon souls. The combat was exhausting, brutal. By the time the portal chamber was reached, the Dragonborn was bleeding from a dozen wounds. The portal was a swirling mass of energy, purple and black, reality, stretched thin, like fabric, pulled too tight. Looking at it hurt, made eyes water, made minds recoil from comprehension of what it represented. This was not a door, this was a tear, a wound in existence that led to somewhere that should not be accessible to the living. The Dragonborn stepped through, anyway, because the alternative was letting Alduin consume Sovngarde completely. The transition was agony. The living body forced into the realm of the dead, every cell screaming that this was wrong. That flesh did not belong here. That breath and heartbeat and warm blood were violations of this space. The Dragonborn emerged on the other side and fell to knees, vomited, waited for the vertigo to pass. When vision cleared, Sovngarde stretched out before them. It was beautiful. Rolling hills of golden grass beneath a sky that held aurora lights in permanent display. The Hall of Valor rose in the distance, a structure so massive it made mountains look small. The souls of warriors walked the fields, sparred with each other, laughed, feasted at tables that appeared from nothing, and offered food that never ran out. This was paradise. This was the reward. This should have been untouchable. But over everything hung a mist, thick, unnatural. It moved against the wind, moved with purpose. The mist was Alduin's doing. His presence corrupted the space. His hunger manifested as fog that isolated souls, separated them from each other, made them vulnerable to being picked off one by one. The Dragonborn could hear screaming in the distance, could see shapes moving in the mist, could feel the wrongness radiating from every direction. The path to the Hall of Valor was blocked, the mist too thick to navigate. The Dragonborn needed help, called out in dragon tongue, challenged the mist itself. Eventually shapes emerged. 3 souls, Hakon One Eye, Gormlaith, Golden Hilt, Feldir the Old, the ancient heroes who had banished Alduin the first time. They had died and come to Sovngarde, and now they were trapped here with everyone else. They recognized the Dragonborn, recognized the dragon soul inside mortal flesh. They asked if this was the one from prophecy. The Dragonborn confirmed, asked for their help clearing the mist. They agreed without hesitation. They had been waiting for this, waiting centuries for another chance. Their eternal rest had been disturbed. Their fellow warriors were being consumed. They would fight again, would fight always if necessary. Together they used the clear skies, shout, 4 voices combining, 4 wills pushing against Alduin's corruption. The mist retreated, slowly at first, then faster. It pulled back toward the Hall of Valor, revealing the path, revealing what waited at the end. Alduin perched atop the hall like a gargoyle, wings spread, mouth still wet from consuming a soul. He saw the Dragonborn approaching and laughed. The sound shook the ground. He spoke in the dragon tongue, said he had been expecting this, that prophecy was predictable, that the Dragonborn was walking into a trap, that in Sovngarde he was strongest, fed by consumed souls, empowered by being in the realm of the dead. He could not die here because death had no meaning here. He was beyond reach, beyond harm, beyond consequence. The Dragonborn did not respond with words, responded with dragon rend, the 3 words that forced immortals to feel mortality. The shout struck Alduin mid-laugh. He crashed to the ground. The impact cratered the golden earth. For the second time in his existence, Alduin felt the possibility of ending, felt the walls of eternity pressing in, felt fear that he had thought he had conquered millennia ago. The battle began not with fire, but with rage. Alduin's rage at being challenged, at having his sanctuary invaded, at being forced to feel limited again. He fought with everything. Every shout he knew, every trick he had learned across ages. He burned the ground, froze the air, tore reality with his voice. The ancient heroes fought beside the Dragonborn, 4 against 1. But the one was Alduin. Hakon was struck by fire and fell. His soul began to fade, dying again, even in death. Gormlaith charged and was caught by Alduin's jaws, crushed, released, her soul scattered like ash. Feldur tried to use an elder scroll he had somehow kept even in death. Alduin saw it coming and destroyed the scroll with a word. Feldur aged backward, became younger, then became nothing, unmade. The Dragonborn stood alone, wounded, exhausted, facing a creature that had existed since time began, facing the World-Eater himself. This should have been impossible, should have been suicide. But the Dragonborn had advantages Alduin did not understand, had the souls of dozens of dragons, had knowledge accumulated from absorbed essences, had something else, something harder to define, the understanding that this moment was why they existed. That prophecy was not destiny, it was opportunity. The dragon rend again. Alduin grounded. The Dragonborn closed distance, used sword and shout in combination, struck scales that should have been impenetrable, drew blood that should have been impossible to spill. Alduin retaliated, bit, clawed, threw the Dragonborn across the field. Bones broke, internal bleeding began. The Dragonborn stood anyway, because staying down meant death, meant failure, meant Alduin would consume all of Sovngarde and then return to the mortal world unstoppable. The fight lasted hours, or minutes. Time worked differently here. Each exchange felt eternal and instantaneous. The Dragonborn learned Alduin's patterns, learned when he inhaled before using Thulm, learned which wing was weaker from an old injury, learned that his left eye had a blind spot, used this knowledge, exploited every weakness, fought with intelligence when strength alone would fail. Alduin grew weaker, not from damage, from something else, from the realization that he had abandoned his purpose, that he was no longer the World-Eater, that he had become obsessed with revenge instead of cosmic duty, that this obsession had made him vulnerable in ways his true role never would have. The crack in his armor widened, the corruption of purpose becoming fatal flaw. The final blow was not dramatic, was not cinematic. The Dragonborn simply found an opening and took it, drove the blade between scales at the throat. Twisted, Alduin's roar became gurgle. He thrashed, tried to fly, could not, fell. The ground shook. He looked at the Dragonborn with eyes that held confusion, held the question of how this was possible. The Dragonborn had no answer, had only survived. Alduin's body began to disintegrate, but not like other dragons. His soul did not emerge to be absorbed. Instead, he simply faded, became light, became energy, became nothing. The World-Eater unmade himself because he had abandoned what made him necessary. Without purpose, even gods can die. Without role, even the eternal can end. He faded completely, left nothing behind but silence. The Dragonborn stood in the aftermath, waited to feel victorious. Felt only empty, felt the weight of dragon souls pressing down, felt the certainty that this victory had cost something irreplaceable. The heroes of old were gone, consumed by Alduin before they could be saved. Sovngarde was restored but damaged. The living did not belong here. The Dragonborn needed to leave. The return to Skyrim was disorienting. The portal deposited the Dragonborn back at Skuldafn, back in the realm of flesh and time and consequence. Udaving waited. He felt Alduin's death. Every dragon everywhere felt it, the connection severed. The firstborn gone. He looked at the Dragonborn with something between respect and fear, asked what happened. The Dragonborn said simply that Alduin was dead, would not return. The Kalpa cycle was broken. Reality would have to figure out what came next. Udaving flew the Dragonborn back to the throat of the world. The journey was silent. What words could address what had happened? The natural order had been disrupted. The being who was supposed to end the world had been ended himself. Dragons everywhere felt untethered, lost. They had lived for millennia, knowing their purpose was to serve the World-Eater, to enforce his will, to prepare for the day he would consume everything. Now that purpose was gone. They were immortal creatures, with nothing to be immortal for. Paarthurnax waited at the summit. He had meditated through the entire final confrontation, had felt Alduin's death like losing a limb. His brother was gone. The dragon who had defined his entire existence through opposition was no more. He looked at the Dragonborn with eyes that held sorrow and relief in equal measure, asked the question whose answer he already knew. "Is it done?" The Dragonborn nodded, said nothing else because nothing else needed saying. The ancient dragon spoke of consequences. Without Alduin, the Kalpa cycle could not complete. The world would age, would grow sick, would rot from the inside because the mechanism for renewal had been destroyed. Reality was meant to end and begin again. That was the design. Without the reset, existence would stagnate, would become corrupted, would eventually collapse under its own weight in ways no one could predict. The Dragonborn had saved the world by dooming it to a different kind of ending. Paarthurnax did not blame, did not accuse, simply stated facts. Alduin had abandoned his role, had become unworthy, had needed to be stopped. The Dragonborn had done what prophecy demanded, but prophecy never accounts for what comes after, never explains how to live with the consequences of necessary actions. The world was saved. The world was also broken. Both truths existed simultaneously. The Dragonborn descended the mountain alone. Each step felt heavier than the climb up. The weight was not physical, was the understanding that heroism and tragedy were sometimes the same thing, that saving everyone meant damaging something fundamental, that victory could taste like ash even when it was real and earned and necessary. The absorbed dragon souls pressed down. Dozens of ancient consciousnesses sharing space inside a mortal mind. The distinction between self and other was blurring. Skyrim celebrated. Towns threw festivals. Jarls composed songs. Bards created legends that bore little resemblance to what actually happened. The Dragonborn was hailed as savior, as chosen one, as the hero who ended the dragon threat forever. People wanted simple stories, wanted clear victories, wanted to believe that evil had been defeated and good had triumphed and everything was fine now. The Dragonborn let them believe, let them have their comfort. Truth was often less kind than fiction, but the dragons were still alive. Leaderless but not gone, they scattered across Tamriel. Some fled to Akabir. Some buried themselves in remote corners where mortals would never find them. Some tried to integrate, to live quietly, to find purpose in a world that no longer had use for them. A few became scholars, studying magic, documenting history, trying to contribute something other than fear. Most simply hid and waited to see what time would do to them. The civil war continued. Stormcloaks and Imperials still killing each other over politics that seemed meaningless compared to what had just been prevented. The Dragonborn tried to care, tried to invest in the outcome, but after facing the World-Eater, after absorbing the essence of beings who had existed for thousands of years, mortal conflicts felt small, petty. The dragon perspective was poisoning the mortal view, making empathy difficult, making connection to humanity tenuous. The Greybeards offered sanctuary, said the Dragonborn could stay at High Hrothgar, could learn the way of the voice as philosophy, could spend decades meditating on the Thu'um, could find peace in isolation. The offer was tempting, but the Dragonborn knew what it really was: exile disguised as honor. The Greybeards understood that the Dragonborn was dangerous, that holding that much power in mortal flesh was unstable, that eventually the dragon nature would overwhelm the mortal nature completely. Delphine sent word through intermediaries. The blades would serve again if the Dragonborn reconsidered about Paarthurnax, would pledge loyalty, would help rebuild the order. All it required was killing one dragon who had committed atrocities millennia ago. One dragon who had helped stop Alduin, but had also helped create the dragon cult. Justice demanded his death. The pragmatic part of the Dragonborn understood this argument. The part that had spoken with Paarthurnax, that had learned from him, that understood redemption was possible even for monsters. That part refused. The choice meant the blades remained fractured, meant an ancient order stayed broken, meant that when the next crisis came, and there was always a next crisis, there would be no Dragon Guard to respond. The Dragonborn accepted this consequence, chose principle over practicality, chose to believe that some debts were paid through change rather than death. The decision felt right, but the cost was real. Months passed. The Dragonborn traveled Skyrim, helping where help was needed, clearing bandit camps, dealing with rogue mages, solving problems that were mundane compared to fighting dragons but mattered to the people experiencing them. It felt like playing mortal, like pretending to be something that was slipping further away with each absorbed soul. The disconnect grew. Conversations with humans felt like conversations with children, not from arrogance, from the simple fact that mortal concerns no longer resonated the way they should. One night, the Dragonborn dreamed in dragon tongue, woke speaking words that belonged to a dragon named Volyutnak, who had been absorbed near Riften. The dream was his memory, flying over kingdoms that no longer existed, burning cities whose names were lost to history. The memory felt as real as the Dragonborn's own childhood, more real. Because dragon memories spanned centuries while mortal memories spanned decades. The balance was shifting. The self was fragmenting. A child in Whiterun asked the Dragonborn what it felt like to be a hero. The Dragonborn looked at this child and tried to remember being that young, that innocent, that certain that the world was divided into simple categories of good and evil. Tried to explain that heroism was complicated, that saving the world sometimes meant breaking it in different ways, that power came with costs, that songs never mentioned. The child did not understand, asked again what it felt like. The Dragonborn said it felt heavy. The child looked confused, wandered off to find an adult who would give better answers. The Jarl of Whiterun offered land, titles, position in court, recognition and reward for services rendered. The Dragonborn accepted the land but declined everything else. Built a house in the wilderness, far from towns, far from people who expected heroism. The house had a library where books on dragons could be collected, a forge where weapons could be maintained, an alchemy lab where potions could be brewed. It was peaceful, isolated, lonely in ways that both helped and hurt. Letters arrived occasionally, from graybeards checking on well-being, from jarls requesting assistance, from scholars asking questions about dragon lore. The Dragonborn answered some, ignored others. The line between which letters mattered and which did not became increasingly arbitrary. Mortal concerns felt distant, abstract. The dragon souls whispered constantly now, offered perspectives, shared memories, made it difficult to remember which thoughts were originally the Dragonborn's and which belonged to the absorbed essences. Parthurnax visited once, flew down from his mountain peak to check on his student. They spoke in dragon tongue because switching to the common language felt like wearing clothes that no longer fit properly. The ancient dragon asked how the Dragonborn was managing the weight of absorbed souls. The honest answer was not well, that the mortal mind was never meant to hold this much, that sanity was negotiable when consciousness was shared among dozens of entities. Parthurnax nodded, said it would get worse before it got better, that the only path forward was meditation, acceptance, learning to be multiple things simultaneously without losing the core of who you started as. The Dragonborn asked what happened to the Kelpis cycle now. Parthurnax admitted he did not know, that Alduin's death had created a situation without precedent, that reality would have to adapt. Either something else would rise to fulfill the World-Eater's role or the cycle would break completely. He suspected the latter, said it might take thousands of years for the consequences to manifest, that the Dragonborn would be long dead before the world paid the full price for survival. There was comfort in that thought, small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. Time continued its march because time cared nothing for the beings it carried forward. Seasons changed. Winters came and went. The dragons faded into legend again. Children born after Alduin's defeat grew up hearing stories but not really believing. History becoming myth, becoming fairy tale. The cycle of forgetting that mortals were so skilled at. The Dragonborn watched it happen, watched the truth get buried under layers of revision and simplification, watched heroism get reduced to songs sung by drunks in taverns. The political landscape shifted. The Civil War eventually ended through exhaustion rather than victory. Neither Stormcloaks nor Imperials won decisively. They simply ran out of soldiers willing to die for causes that felt increasingly pointless. A treaty was signed. Borders were redrawn. Life continued because life always continues. The Thalmor schemed in the background, but their schemes were patient, measured in generations. The Dragonborn was relevant to immediate threats but irrelevant to plots that would take centuries to mature. Other adventures called. Daedric princes offered quests. Vampires needed stopping. Ancient evils buried in ruins tried to wake. The Dragonborn dealt with these threats when they arose, not from duty, not from heroism, from simple pragmatism. The world needed defending. The Dragonborn had the power to defend it. Therefore, defending happened. It was mechanics without passion, function without feeling, going through motions, because motion was preferable to stillness. But stillness came eventually anyway. The Dragonborn grew tired, not physically. The absorbed dragon souls provided stamina beyond mortal limits. The tiredness was deeper, spiritual, the exhaustion of being multiple beings simultaneously, of carrying memories that spanned epochs, of existing between mortal and divine, without belonging fully to either. The house in the wilderness became less refuge and more prison. The isolation that had seemed healing became suffocating. One winter, the Dragonborn decided to climb the throat of the world again, not to visit Parthenax, not to meditate, just to stand at the peak and remember what it felt like to be mortal, to be small, to look at vast spaces and feel appropriately insignificant. The climb took days. The snow was heavy that year. Each step felt like argument, like the mountain itself was asking whether this journey was necessary. The Dragonborn climbed anyway, because stubbornness was the one purely mortal trait that remained undiluted. At the summit, the Dragonborn stood where Alduin had fallen, where the World-Eater had been banished the first time, where prophecy had intersected with history twice. The wind howled. The stars were visible, clear and cold and distant. The absorbed souls were quiet for once, as if they too felt the weight of this place, the holiness of standing where reality had been rewritten multiple times. The Dragonborn thought about the prisoner who had knelt at the execution block in Helgen, the nobody with no name and no destiny who should have died like everyone else in that town. Thought about how random chance had placed that prisoner at exactly the right place and time for prophecy to grab hold. About how destiny was just chaos with narrative structure imposed after the fact. About how the difference between hero and corpse was often nothing more than accidentally surviving the first 5 minutes. That prisoner was gone now, dead in every way that mattered. The person standing on this mountain was something else. Something that contained that prisoner, along with dozens of dragons. A collective consciousness wearing mortal flesh, like a costume, that no longer fit. The Dragonborn wondered if this was what all heroes experienced. If power always consumed the person who wielded it. If saving the world always required losing yourself in the process. No answer came. Just wind. Just cold. Just the certainty that some questions do not have answers, that existence requires accepting ambiguity, that meaning is something you create rather than something you find. The Dragonborn descended the mountain, returned to the house in the wilderness, continued living because the alternative was dying, and dying felt like surrender. Years passed in this fashion. The Dragonborn became legend. Then myth, then rumor. Sightings were reported but unconfirmed. Some said the Dragonborn had died. Some said they had left Skyrim. Some said they had achieved some form of ascension and no longer walked among mortals. The truth was simpler and sadder. The Dragonborn was still there, still alive, just increasingly removed from mortal concerns, existing in spaces between. Visiting civilization, less and less, becoming hermit, becoming ghost, becoming myth while still breathing. The dragons who remained in Skyrim occasionally sought the Dragonborn out, not to fight, to talk, to discuss philosophy, with the only being who could understand both mortal and draconic perspectives. These conversations were strange, strained, like family reunions, where everyone knows they share blood but cannot remember why that should matter. The dragon spoke of boredom, of purposelessness, of existing without direction. The Dragonborn understood perfectly, shared the same void. One conversation with Alduin stuck. The Red Dragon asked whether the Dragonborn regretted killing Alduin, whether saving the world was worth the cost. The Dragonborn thought for a long time before answering, said regret was complicated, that the choice was necessary, but the necessity did not make it good, that preventing the end of the Kalpa cycle had been right in the moment, but might prove catastrophic across centuries. That heroism was often just choosing which catastrophe to allow. Alduin understood, said that was the burden of power. Having to make choices where all outcomes were terrible, and picking the least terrible was considered victory. The Dragonborn asked Alduin what dragons would do now. What comes after purpose is taken away. The Red Dragon said they would endure, that dragons were good at enduring, that they had existed before mortals, and would likely exist after mortals, that they would find new purposes, or simply exist without purpose, that immortality meant having infinite time to figure out meaning. The answer was not comforting, was honest. Sometimes honesty and comfort cannot coexist. In the quiet moments between adventures, between conversations, between the demands that the world occasionally placed, the Dragonborn would sit and listen to the absorbed souls. They spoke less often now, had integrated more completely, but sometimes individual voices would emerge, would share fragment of memory, would offer perspective on current situation. It was like having ancestors living in your head, offering guidance, providing context, making loneliness less lonely, but also making solitude less peaceful. The world moved on. New threats emerged, were dealt with. Peace lasted until it did not. Conflict resumed until exhaustion forced another pause. The cycle continued, because cycles were the nature of reality, even without Alduin to enforce them. The Dragonborn participated when participation was required, withdrew when withdrawal was permitted, existed in the margins, neither fully part of the world nor fully separate from it. A living legend who wished desperately to be ordinary again, but could never return to ordinary. Children were born, who would never see a dragon, who would grow old and die before the next dragon crisis, who would live entire lives in the peace that the Dragonborn had purchased. They would never know the name of their savior, would never understand the sacrifice made on their behalf. This was fine. This was how it should be. Heroes who require recognition are not really heroes. They are performers. The Dragonborn had no audience and needed none. The work was the point. The survival of future generations was the reward. But some nights the weight was too much. Some nights the Dragonborn stood outside the house and screamed, used the Thuum to shake mountains, to split clouds, to express rage and grief and frustration that had no other outlet. The voice that could kill dragons used to howl at uncaring stars. No one heard these screams. No one came to help. There was no help available. Power isolated, strength separated. Being strong enough to save everyone meant being too strong to connect with anyone. The Dragonborn wondered sometimes about the other heroes of prophecy, the Nerevarine who had stopped the blight in Morrowind, the champion who had ended the Oblivion crisis. Did they feel this same alienation, this same sense of being used by destiny and then discarded when no longer needed? Probably. Heroism looked glorious in songs, but felt hollow in practice. Felt like being tool that served its purpose and now sat rusting in corner while life continued around it. Still the Dragonborn endured, because endurance was all that remained, because giving up felt like betraying everyone who had died so that this moment could exist. Helgen and Gormlaith and Feldir had sacrificed everything. The people of Helgen had burned. The warriors who had faced dragons across centuries had bled. Their deaths demanded that survival means something, that the future they purchased was honored by being lived, even when living felt more like burden than gift. And so life continued. Days became weeks, became years. The house in the wilderness weathered storms. The books in the library accumulated dust. The forge grew cold more often than hot. The Dragonborn existed, not thrived, not flourished, simply existed, which was its own kind of victory, which was enough, which had to be enough, because the alternative was despair. And despair was luxury that heroes could not afford. The world needed defenders even when defending offered no joy, needed strength even when strength offered no comfort, needed someone willing to stand between civilization and chaos. The Dragonborn would stand, would continue standing, would stand until standing was no longer possible. This was the burden, this was the cost. This was what prophecy took and never returned. In the deepest hours of night, when sleep would not come and memories pressed too close, the Dragonborn would speak to the absorbed souls, would ask if they regretted their deaths, if being consumed was better or worse than whatever afterlife they might have reached. The souls never answered directly, could not answer directly. They were fragments, echoes, not complete consciousnesses. But sometimes the Dragonborn felt something that might have been contentment, might have been acceptance. The souls existed in ways they could not have existed otherwise, were preserved when they should have faded. It was not the existence they would have chosen, but it was existence. The Dragonborn understood, lived an existence that was not chosen, that was not desired, but that served purpose. That mattered to people who would never know it mattered. This understanding brought no peace, but it brought something adjacent to peace, brought the ability to continue, to take next breath, to face next day, to stand when standing seemed pointless, because standing was the point. Skyrim turned. Seasons cycled. The world aged without ending. Without Alduin, the Kalpa could not complete. Reality bent under the strain of existing beyond its intended duration. Cracks appeared in the fabric of existence, but they were small, manageable. Perhaps in 1,000 years they would widen, would tear, would bring the collapse that Alduin's death had only delayed. But that was future's problem. The present required only persistence, required only that someone keep watch. The Dragonborn kept watch, would keep watch until watching was no longer possible. And in that watching, in that endless vigilance, there was something almost like purpose. Not the grand purpose that prophecy had promised, not the clear meaning that song suggested, but the quiet purpose of simply being present, of witnessing, of standing ready. It was not glorious, it was not celebrated, but it was real. And after everything, reality was all that remained. The wind blew across Skyrim's peaks. The snow fell on ancient ruins. The dragons slept in their hidden places. The mortals lived their brief and brilliant lives. The Dragonborn existed between all of these things. Neither mortal nor dragon, neither legend nor person, just witness, just guardian, just the one who remained when everyone else had moved on. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps survival itself was victory. Perhaps living through the aftermath was the true test. Not the dramatic confrontation, not the prophesied battle, but the long years that followed, the decades of existing without purpose, of carrying weight that no one else could see, of being strong when strength offered no reward. The Dragonborn stood at the window of the wilderness house and watched the sun set over mountains that had seen civilizations rise and fall, watched the stars emerge one by one, watched the moons trace their familiar paths, listened to the absorbed souls settling into comfortable silence, felt the weight that would never lift, accepted that weight, chose to carry it for one more day, and then another, and then another, because that was what heroes did. Not in the moment of triumph, but in all the moments that came after, when the songs had ended, when the celebration had faded, when the world had forgotten. Heroes carried on, not because they wanted to, not because it brought them joy, but because someone had to, because the alternative was abandoning the watch, and the watch could never be abandoned. So the Dragonborn watched, and waited, and endured, and in that endurance gave meaning to all the sacrifice that had come before, made the deaths matter, made the struggle worth it, not for personal gain, not for recognition, but for the simple fact that the world continued, that children laughed, that crops grew, that life persisted. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, that was enough. The tale ends not with resolution, but with continuation, not with answers, but with acceptance. The Dragonborn remains. Skyrim remains. The cycle broken, but the world enduring. Some stories do not have endings. They have pauses. They have breaths taken before the next chapter. This is such a pause. This is such a breath. But legends never truly end. They simply wait. Wait in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moment before thunder, in the silence that follows screams. They wait for the one brave enough to remember them, for the one foolish enough to need them, for the moment when the world once again requires someone willing to stand against the impossible. That moment will come. It always comes. The watch continues. The guardian remains. And when the next crisis emerges from whatever depth spawns such things, when the next threat rises to challenge everything that mortals have built, there will be someone standing ready. Someone who has stood ready for years, for decades, for however long it takes. The Dragonborn will be there, not because prophecy demands it, not because duty requires it, but because someone must be there. Someone must remember. Someone must carry the weight, so that others can live free of it. This is the burden. This is the calling. This is what it means to be the last Dragonborn. And in the end, after all the songs have been sung, and all the stories told, and all the glory faded, that is the truth that remains. Not the dragon slaying, not the world saving, but the simple act of standing watch, of remaining ready, of enduring beyond what should be endurable. That is heroism. That is sacrifice. That is what prophecy takes and never gives back. And the Dragonborn carries it all, carries it still, will carry it until the very last breath, and perhaps even beyond. The echoes remain. The watch continues. The legend endures. And somewhere in the night, a dragon dreams of fire and remembers when the sky belonged to them, remembers when mortals knew their place, remembers the World-Eater who was supposed to return and never did. The dragon wakes, looks at the stars, wonders if the order of things will ever be restored, wonders if purpose will ever return, wonders if meaning can be found in a world that has outlived its intended ending. The dragon finds no answers. Only questions, only the same uncertainty that everyone carries, mortal and immortal alike, all of them searching, all of them enduring, all of them existing in the aftermath of prophecy fulfilled. The world turns, reality persists, and the story continues in ways no one can predict, because the future is unwritten, because destiny was fulfilled. And now there is only choice, because the end that was supposed to come did not come, and everything that follows is improvisation. This is where legends are born, not in the moment of triumph, but in what comes after, in the long years of uncertain peace, in the quiet struggles that no one will remember, in the simple act of continuing when continuation seems pointless. The Dragonborn knows this, accepts this, carries this knowledge like everything else. One more weight added to the collection, one more burden that cannot be shared, one more truth that cannot be spoken because words would diminish it, and so the watching continues. The guarding persists, the legend endures. Not loud, not bright, not celebrated, but steady, reliable, present, ready for whatever comes next, ready for the moment when the world needs saving again, ready to stand, ready to fight, ready to pay whatever price is demanded. Because that is what it means to be Dragonborn. Not the power, not the glory, but the willingness to sacrifice everything. The readiness to stand alone, the strength to endure when endurance seems impossible. The tale has been told, the legend has been shared, the echoes will carry it forward through time and memory. And when future generations sit around fires and tell stories of the last Dragonborn who faced the World-Eater, they will remember the battle, they will remember the victory, they will remember the hero. But they will not remember the cost, will not know the weight, will not understand the sacrifice. Because some things cannot be translated into song. Some truths cannot survive the transition from experience to story. Some burdens must be carried in silence. The Dragonborn understands this, has always understood, carries the burden anyway, not for recognition, not for reward, but because it is necessary, because someone must, because the alternative is unacceptable. And in that understanding, in that acceptance, in that willingness to bear what cannot be shared, there is a kind of peace, not happiness, not joy, but peace. The peace of knowing your purpose even when that purpose brings no comfort. The peace of standing watch, even when no one remembers you are there. This is the final truth. This is what remains when everything else has faded. Not the legend, not the glory, but the simple fact of endurance, of continuation, of existing beyond what should have been the ending. The Dragonborn remains. Skyrim remains. The world remains. And that is victory enough. That is meaning enough. That is the conclusion that no song will ever capture, but that every heart understands. The watch continues. The story lives on. The legend breathes still. And somewhere in the darkness, between one heartbeat and the next, destiny waits to see what happens when prophecy ends and life begins.